God gave them a baby boy. Remember, Abraham and Sarah were pretty old. Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. But God still kept his promise. He gave them a precious child, and they named him Isaac. As Isaac grew older, Abraham loved him so much because guess what? He was old when God gave him Isaac. God kept his promise. He gave Abraham and Sarah a baby boy, who they named Isaac. Isaac was a daily reminder of God's faithfulness and promise. Remember what a reminder is, boys and girls. It's something that we know that we have to do, like our chores when mom and dad says we have to clean our room, pick up our toys when dad says we have to clean up our room. And then that promise, God was faithful in what he gave to Abraham and Sarah. I have a question for you. How old was Abraham and Sarah when Isaac was born? I see you. I see you're nodding. Yes, you are absolutely right. Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. Good job. I can tell you guys are listening. Great job. Then God gave Abraham a test. Who of us like tests? I know sometimes I don't like tests, but when God gives us a test, he is testing us to see how faithful we are. So God told Abraham, take your son Isaac. That's not hard. That's not a test. Take him where, God? Take him. Sacrifice him to me. Abraham was heartbroken, but he loved God, and he knew that he must obey him. He knew that God was good and that God would keep his promises and provide another sacrifice. So if God tells us to do something, we should be obedient, right? Yes, I can see you smiling. You're thinking, when my mom and dad tells me to do something and they promise me something, I know that they're going to keep their word. So what did God ask Abraham to do? I see your hand. Yes, he asked him to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to him. Remember, being obedient to God, keeping his promises, there's always going to be a reward. Early the next morning, Abraham, Isaac, and 2 servants set out to sacrifice to God. They loaded up the donkey with wood and traveled for 3 days to get to the right place. It was called Moriah. They climbed the mountain, and Abraham built an altar. Isaac did not see any animals for the sacrifice. Boys and girls, what do you think? If your mom says we're going to go on a trip and dad says we're going to go on a trip, you're just going to be ready to go on that trip. You're going to be obedient, right? You're going to get in the car, you're going to pack up your items, and you'll be ready to go. Well, that's what Abraham did. Abraham took Isaac and his servants with him, but Isaac was looking around. Where's the sacrifice? But he didn't ask. He was obedient. So Abraham assured Isaac that God would provide the offering himself. With tears in his eyes, pleading to God, Abraham tied up his son upon the altar. He was grieved beyond description. He was so heartbroken. But Abraham, as he was obedient to God, he continued to do what God asked him to do. He lifted that knife above his head to offer his son's life as a sacrifice. Now, we've gone pretty far in the story this morning, boys and girls. We've talked about Abraham being obedient, God's promise to Abraham and Sarah to give them a child, and they produced a son, Isaac. Where did Abraham now take Isaac and his servants to make the sacrifice? We're talking about a place. That place was Moriah. Suddenly, as Abraham is ready to provide offer the sacrifice, guess what happened? Abraham, an angel of the Lord said, don't harm the boy, because you were willing to sacrifice your son in obedience to God. I know that you fear him. Remember, boys and girls, when mom and dad ask us to do something, it's important that we are obedient, because you never know what they have in store for you. Oftentimes, it's to see what you and how you will accomplish a deed, because they have something important for you, as God had for Abraham. Relieved, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw a ram caught in a thicket. Remember, a thicket is bushes as we know it today. So we want to make sure that we're following along. Abraham was so overjoyed his son Isaac would live. God had provided a sacrifice. God would always keep his promises. Abraham took the ram and sacrificed it to the Lord. It was a beautiful lesson God showed Abraham. One day, Jesus, God's only son, would be given in a similar way as a sacrifice for the sin of all mankind. Boys and girls, the ultimate is for us to make sure that we're obedient to what God asks us to do, to listen to our parents, to follow their instructions, and to make sure that we're in his will. So now, what did God provide as an offering in place of Isaac? I see you. I see your hand. I can see your nod. Yes, he did. He provided a ram to prepare as an offering to the Lord. Boys and girls, you've been a great audience today. You've participated. I appreciate your attention. And so we want to make sure that we realize that our story today was about Abraham, his wife Sarah, and how God gave them a promise to provide them a child whose name was Isaac. It didn't matter their age because God fulfilled his promise and he gave them a son. Their son was named Isaac. Have a great day. Remember, it's all about being obedient to God.
Abraham and his wife Sarah were very rich. They had lots of camels, lots of possessions, and many servants. But they were missing something very important. They had no children. One day, God gave Abraham a promise that he would have many descendants, more than the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. Impossible, thought Abraham. I'm too old to have kids. My wife is too old. Sarah did not believe the promise and could not wait, so she decided to give her servant Hagar to Abraham so he could conceive a child with her. And so they did. A boy named Ishmael was born. Though Sarah made her own plans, God did not break his promise. Even though it was physically impossible for Abraham and Sarah to have any kids, God gave them a baby boy. Abraham was 100 and his wife Sarah was 90 when they had a precious child. They named him Isaac. As Isaac grew older, Abraham loved him even more. He taught him about God, and Isaac was a daily reminder of God's faithfulness and promise. But then, something happened. God was going to give Abraham a test. God told Abraham, "Take your son Isaac, sacrifice him to me." Abraham was heartbroken. But he loved God. He knew that he must obey God. He knew that God was good and that God would keep his promises and provide another sacrifice. Early the next morning, Abraham, Isaac, and some servants set out to sacrifice to God. They loaded up the donkey with wood and traveled for 3 days to get to the right place. It was called Moriah. They climbed the mountain, and Abraham built an altar. Isaac did not see any animals for the sacrifice and did not understand what Abraham was about to do. Abraham assured Isaac that God would provide the offering himself. With tears in his eyes, pleading to God, Abraham tied up his son upon the altar. He was grieved beyond description. He was heartbroken. Then Abraham lifted the knife to offer his son's life as a sacrifice. But something happened. A voice spoke. "Abraham, Abraham." It was an angel's voice, speaking for God. "Don't harm the boy. I know that you fear God, since you were willing to sacrifice your son in obedience to God." Then the voice told Abraham to look at a nearby bush. There was a ram caught in a thicket. Abraham was overjoyed. His son Isaac would live. God had provided a sacrifice. God would always keep his promises. Abraham took the ram and sacrificed it to the Lord. It was a beautiful lesson God showed Abraham. One day, the Messiah, Jesus, God's only Son, would be given in a similar way as the sacrifice for the sin of all mankind.